What's up, everyone? I'm your host, Jared Harris, and you're listening to Beats by Jer. Today, I want to test out an episode format I've had since long before the show launched, but just haven't gotten around to it as of yet. Musical hot takes. We've all got them. Ideas that go against the grain, ideas that explore lesser known gems, or things that just grind your gears. With this, I hope to look at different artists in lesser conventional ways, allowing myself to explore their catalog through a unique lens and perhaps shining a light somewhere else, somewhere that the light isn't often shone. Maybe this will become a reoccurring series, maybe it won't. If you dig it, let me know. Like I've said though, I've had this idea for a format since the very beginning, and it largely stemmed from the subject of this very episode. And when I was flipping through my notebook of just ideas that I had written out that I had just kind of left in the early brainstorm stages, this was the very first one that was there. Today's hot take will look at Pink Floyd. It is generally accepted that Pink Floyd is the dark side of the moon, or maybe the wall. A pair of conceptual masterpieces that are legendary examples of exemplary experimentation, creativity, and songwriting that have remained vitally influential for classic rock and prog, and I would argue popular music as a whole. Despite this, I would like to turn your attention to a different album. Something which still is not of cult status. It's not lesser known. I'm not pulling out a deep cut here on you. Nonetheless, I feel as though that this record just simply exists within the shadow of the former two. I take your dark side of the moon, I take the wall, and I raise you, wish you were here. For context, let's begin with a quick look at Pink Floyd. Formed in 1963 in London as Sigma 6, the band would go through a number of name changes, including the Megadeths, the T-Set, the Pink Floyd Sound, and the Pink Floyd, before settling on Pink Floyd for their debut album, 1967's The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. The band made their emergence towards the end of the British invasion period while pioneering a psychedelic sound. The initial lineup included Roger Waters, Nick Mason, Richard Wright, and Syd Barrett, who would make his exit on account of his mental illness exacerbated by his use of psychedelics during the making of their second album, which also saw David Gilmour join the fold. The band would release numerous albums, each building upon the success of the previous one. However, it wasn't until the release of Dark Side of the Moon in 1973 that Pink Floyd would become a global phenomenon. This, of course, is not a slight at the records that came before 73, but you could make the argument that the band that existed between 65 to 72 was not the same band that set out to make Dark Side of the Moon. The first 6 records are really cool, and there are some fantastic songs in there that, for whatever reason, just aren't classic Floyd, despite very much having a very distinctive Pink Floyd sound to them. And while there are underlying progressive elements that pop up here and there, the band, in both their songwriting and performance, simply are not as focused as they would become. The cohesion, the intention that would make their 70s output shine brightest is still being honed at these early stages. Knowing how the story ends, listening to those first few albums, it really does sound as though the band could see where they wanted to be, but they just couldn't quite get there until 1973, whether the ideas weren't fully formed, whether it was a financial issue, whether it was waiting for technology to catch up to them. There are so many elements on those that first series of albums that feels like they're just approaching the door to what is to come from 73 and onward. The Dark Side of the Moon would change it all for the band. Pink Floyd would go on to release a string of absolutely classic records up until 1983's The Final Cut, which would lead to the departure of Waters and start decades of very vocal feuding between himself and Gilmour over the Pink Floyd estate, the use of the name, and seemingly everything under the sun. The drama between these two is fantastic. And of course, by fantastic, I mean it's good for a quick laugh, but it's just kind of sad that the problems that these two incredibly successful musicians have will forever remain such a large part of the band's legacy. While the band would move forward without Rogers with the release of 3 albums between 1987 and 2014. 73 to 79 represents an absolutely incredible run in all of popular music across all genres. By all comparisons, what Pink Floyd were doing in that 6-year period was magnificent, unparalleled, unprecedented, incredibly creative. And it made them among the biggest artists in the world, still arguably to this day. As a result, Pink Floyd remains one of the most commercially successful bands of all time, having sold over 250 million records worldwide, which includes well over 38 million albums sold since 1993, a period which would only see 2 new albums emerge from the band. And while commercial success does not necessarily equate creative success, it is an important tool to measure a legacy and the cultural weight an artist can have in a much more tangible manner. We can argue and debate over the creative leaps or sidesteps of an artist, but dollars are factual. We can't argue about the commercial success of something. I think it's an important metric in that sense, but also worth clarifying for that reason. Beyond how much they sold, culturally, their name evokes an era long gone. An era of late 60s psychedelia that would evolve into a colder and darker reflection of the Cold War throughout the 1970s. Innovators, experimenters, and originators, Pink Floyd remains synonymous with classic rock and are worthy of their legendary status and the reverence they receive even nearly 50 years after the end of their most vital period. Having grown up listening to Q107, Toronto's classic rock radio station, I was pretty familiar with Pink Floyd's greatest hits and the imagery that comes along with that. But without knowing much beyond these hits, I still knew the importance of The Dark Side of the Moon and The Wall. This in itself is such a rare feat, to have your ideology, your imagery, your work permeate through culture and generations without people actually knowing the substance of it all. Like for me to know some of Pink Floyd's songs but still know that The Dark Side of the Moon is a huge deal, that is such an impressive feat. Honestly, it really wasn't until about last year when I decided that I was long overdue for a deep dive into their catalog, which in itself may be the source of this hot take. Around this time, I was in Montreal and went to the Pink Floyd exhibit, Their Mortal Remains. Seeing the stage props, the album props alongside so much more albums, instruments, lyric sheets, that it was such an immersive experience. And having that coincide with my own sort of dive into their work, it was just a really cool exhibit to kind of be able to piece together with what I was listening to at the time. Having not really grown up with the band as much as I did with, say, the Stones or Aerosmith or Zeppelin, um, I came to approach their work significantly later in life. And because of this, I looked at it purely with the hindsight that comes from getting into a band long after they're done. I thoroughly enjoyed The Dark Side of the Moon. I enjoyed The Wall. Both albums are brimming with brilliance. However, it was Wish You Were Here that left me truly blown away. This left me wondering, despite the many innovations of Dark Side and The Wall, why aren't we holding Wish You Were Here on an even greater pedestal than we do? Why is this the album that seems to fall behind these other two? With that in mind, let's begin by looking at The Dark Side of the Moon and The Wall, a pair of albums that bookend one of the most successful, creative, and experimental artistic runs ever. Released in 1973, The Dark Side of the Moon is a 10-song odyssey that will take you on a sonic trip for all of 42 minutes and 53 seconds. The album is truly a conceptual marvel that makes use of the studio equipment, effects, and an overall experimental spirit that is used to its fullest potential. The album is divided into two sides, each consisting of 5 songs, and the 5 songs on each side of the record play through as though they were each one continuous track. Through this, Waters had the idea of unifying the album under a singular theme, the first time that the band had ever done so. And the album progresses to reflect the different stages of life and existence, opening and closing with a heartbeat. Credit where credit is due. It was Waters who suggested an album in this vein. It was Waters who wrote the thematic material on the record. And Waters wrote a vast majority of the music on the album, with only 3 songs on the record without his writing credit. If we look at side 1, we are introduced with said heartbeat on Speak to Me, before the sounds of ticking of clocks, distant voices speaking of madness while another laughs, and the opening and closing of a cash register before the sharp and immediate bellowing screams, seamlessly all leading into Breathe in the Air. In some way, the 2 tracks act as an overture for the rest of the album. Speak to Me fills this role in a more traditional sense, as it is comprised of all these different sounds that will be used throughout the album, introducing them out of context only for them to be revealed later. The discussions of madness and laughter will be heard on Brain Damage, The Clocks on Time, and The Scream on The Great Gig in the Sky. You can also say that Speak to Me is our life in 1 minute and 5 seconds, commencing with a heartbeat and ending in a flashing scream, full of a scrambled cacophony in between. Breathe further serves this notion as an overture in a more thematic sense, with its lyrics hinting at the limitless possibilities that that in between can hold, while warning of the pursuits of capitalism and consumption that can limit said pursuits and even exchange them for an early grave. The album continues into On the Run, an instrumental song led by Wright's synths. John Harris, no relations, I think, wrote a book, The Dark Side of the Moon, and states that the song is a representation of the anxieties of modern travel. But that, to me, doesn't sit right. It just doesn't seem to fit with the themes of the album. The song itself, with its driving pulse and repeated ideas, is bound to elevate your heart rate. There is a sense of stress in the air, certainly, but I don't think it's to do with travel. I think this is a further look at the troubles forced upon society, We are the rabbit that is introduced in Breathe, digging holes to only then dig another one. Reinforcing this is Time, a song that lyrically examines how our life, our greatest resources, is finite, and we spend most of it existing within a construct that works in favor of a select few at the expense of the majority. If you're wondering if I wrote this during my 9 to 5, perhaps you're right. Musically, the brilliance of Time cannot be understated. The song, distinct in its own way, ebbs out of an array of ringing alarm clocks and eventually meanders through a series of verses and a guitar solo before landing at the final verse of Breathe. Yes, the same Breathe from 2 songs ago. It's seamless, almost effortless, and clear as day. It's a phenomenal twist that feels as invigorating as it is simple. Curiously, it's also the only song on the album written by the entire band, and definitely stands out for that twist, bringing Breathe back into the mix. The side one of the record closes with The Great Gig in the Sky and is driven by a stunning vocal performance from Claire Torrey, who was asked to deliver an expressionate performance without words. The band was beyond impressed with her takes and paid her standard session fee, £40, which back then, if we were to factor inflation into it, would be £420 by today's standards. Tori left the studio unsure if they would actually use her vocals, and she wasn't aware that they did until she actually bought her own copy of the record. In 2004, she would go on to sue the band, claiming a 50% writing credit. She won the case. The song itself stands as a metaphor for death, and we can only hope that our own passing should sound as euphoric and soulful as the performance of Claire Torrey. The second half of the album plays as another continuous 5 songs, largely focusing on the conflicts that arise from life within our current societal context. Money, ironically the band's most commercially successful single ever, examines our collective greed and our need for something that's value was only ascribed to it because someone long ago said it was. Us and Them looks at disparity, that between the people and the government, that between the working and the upper class, while effectively using militarism to explore the lengths in which different corporate and political powers will pursue to further their wealth and access to resources through the exploitation of those who serve and at the cost of those they wage war upon. While Any Color You Like looks at the illusion of choice we have in such a society, Brain Damage explores the ideas of mental illness existing within all of this and the toll it takes, especially upon the good-natured who are pressured into pursuing the ladder of success within institutions built upon the backs of those who came before, while also paying tribute to Syd Barrett. Given how close the band was with Barrett, themes of mental illness run throughout much of their music, and it especially allows for them to explore the effects of society, of capitalism, of greed, of corruption, and how that affects people on a very individual basis in a way that's unique, meaningful, and authentic. A song like Brain Damage is a great example of this, but we also see that Brain Damage acts as Waters reflecting on his own success and how he recognizes that he is very much a part of such a society and the global success that Pink Floyd has achieved. It doesn't go unnoticed with him acknowledging that in this song and how that weighs on him with trying to remain based in his roots rather than allowing for the trappings of such wealth to change his output. It makes for a really unique dynamic, especially, and this is not the only time that Waters will draw parallels between Syd Barrett and himself in two ways that feel complementing rather than taking away from one another. The ongoing comparisons to Syd Barrett also leads me to believe that there's a strong feeling of survivor's guilt almost, right? The band was on the verge of success, some success with Syd, and shortly after his departure, we're embarking on global tours and, creating some of the biggest selling albums ever. And I feel as though it weighed heavy on Roger Waters specifically, but probably the entire band, that they were able to find this. And there's an element of wishing that Syd Barrett was able to enjoy and on it all alongside them. But that's just me thinking out loud. The album closes with Eclipse, a call for unity in that we are all just a culmination of our shared and individual experiences. And this should be something that allows for us to grow as a collective in spite of our differences rather than be divided. It's a nice epilogue, and despite the beauty of the music, the dark side of the moon is thematically bleak, making Eclipse a note calling for hope. Have I convinced myself through writing this episode that Dark Side of the Moon is, in fact, the definitive album from Pink Floyd? Not quite, but through extensive listening and research and writing, I definitely have a far greater appreciation for what the band achieved. It's such an ambitious album, and it's so rare that an album as ambitious as this actually lands on the point that they were trying to make in a meaningful way. Everything feels so intentional. There's nothing that's left feeling arbitrary. There's nothing that sticks out as an anomaly amongst the album. It's so cohesive. It's so strong in every way. The thematic nature of the album is brilliant, and you cannot deny the music, particularly Breathe, Time, and Brain Damage. This brings us to 1979's The Wall. This is another album that is often cited as the band's greatest work, and the imagery of the wall is as synonymous with the band as the refracting prism. To understand The Wall, we must recognize that while also a concept album like Dark Side, it is a rock opera that follows Pink, a bitter and disillusioned rock star who creates a psychological wall within himself to isolate him from the rest of the world. And of course, this wall manifests internally and eventually becomes quite literal in the physical world. The album sees Pink growing disconnected from his craft and audience. Through recounting a series of lingering traumas that continue to haunt him, we see Pink closing himself off from the world. Thin Ice recounts the death of his father in World War II, resulting in being raised by a single mother, while Another Brick in the Wall Part 2 addresses a near-tyrannical and highly repressive educational system. Mother hints at the overbearing oppression from his upbringing, and Young Lust highlights the infidelity of his wife while on the road. This leads to a tipping point in One of My Turns, in which Pink brings a groupie back to his hotel room only to violently trash his room in rage, leading us to the idea of both metaphorical and literal self-isolation in Goodbye, Cruel World. When his manager and roadies are unable to reach him, they break into his room and have a paramedic inject him with drugs that enable him to perform. Enter Comfortably Numb, the greatest song on the album, and one of the best to emerge from Pink Floyd's massive catalog. The final arc of this however, is not one of resolve. While you'd think the medicinal integration back into the world would help solve Pink's problems, it only heightens them to a far greater degree. He hallucinates on stage, assuming the role of a fascist dictator at a rally, commanding his followers to turn on minorities and deviants. The album comes to a conclusion with Pink recognizing his transgressions and assessing through a self-imposed trial, eventually breaking down the wall to let the outside world in. If this feels too neatly wrapped up with a bow for a conclusion, the album ends with the words, "Isn't this where?" And if you allow for the record to repeat, it opens with, "We came in." This implies a cyclical nature to this, almost as though Pink is forced to relive his past traumas on the regular, never quite confronting them, but rather allowing for them to manipulate him into a state of almost no return. Much like Dark Side, Waters came up with this concept almost entirely by himself, working alongside producer Bob Ezrin to flesh out the narrative of the album. He based Pink off of some form of both Syd Barrett and himself. And at this stage, Waters was also growing discontent with the relentless touring. He was bothered by the size of venues they were playing, finding it increasingly more challenging to connect with an audience that he could largely not see. At the last show of their tour leading up to this record, he spat on a group of noisy fans at the front. Gilmour was also feeling such a disconnect, and at the same show refused to come out for an encore. This was the inspiration for The Wall. Naturally, the themes of mental health and inner peace are central to Pink Floyd, given their history with Barrett. This is especially apparent on The Wall, but given the cyclical nature implied by the closing line of the album, it feels greatly inspired by the touring industry as a whole. The biting criticisms, Waters is never one to mince words, could be looking at how musicians and their songs are simply products for labels to shop around with on the road and work relentlessly until they reach a breaking point. This machine will chew you up and spit you out without any remorse. This idea is further supported by the fact that the band was in financial trouble around this time and were facing tax rates as high as 83%. The album itself was written entirely by Waters, with the exception of 3 songs co-written with Gilmour: Young Lust, Comfortably Numb, and Run Like Hell, and The Trial, which was written by Waters and Ezrin. In addition to the financial troubles and the disinterest of the road, tensions within the band were high, and Waters actually fired Wright from the band, but kept him on for the album as a session musician. The album was initially met with mixed feelings from critics, many of whom felt the album was pretentious, but has since gone on to be considered among the greatest albums of all time. While I am of the former opinion, one cannot argue with the stats. The Wall sold over 30 million copies, making it the best-selling double album of all time. Thematically, The Wall is a fantastic exploration of mental health within an industry that forces you into an isolating context of means of making, supporting, and growing a career. Musically, however, I feel like the double album, consisting of 26 songs running for an hour 20, is incredibly bloated. There are some definite classics on the album for sure, and this is the record that gave us Comfortably Numb, a song that feels damn near transcendent. However, there are a lot of songs on the record that are just there as a means of developing the narrative, arguably at the expense of delivering a strong song. Some songs feel like fleeting interludes between bigger moments that would benefit from further development. And I'd argue much of the album would benefit from a more collaborative approach in the songwriting. The fact that Gilmour is only credited to 3 songs is criminal. Beyond the cool thematic material, the album feels like the band is splintering apart, and not in a brilliant, fantastical Abbey Road type way, but in the way that feels excessively self-indulgent to Waters' ideas and creative vision. I find The Wall leaves much to be desired, and while I can appreciate the ambition to deliver such a complex and introspective narrative, it just doesn't make for the best musical experience. This, I find, is a common stance I take with most concept albums that rely on an explicit story as opposed to relying on a continuous developing theme. Often, artists will get lost in the storytelling that they forget that this is an album first. Maybe it's just me, but I find concept albums of the thematic nature significantly more compelling and often far more superior than that of the direct narrative approach. This brings me to 1975's Wish You Were Here, the album which I would argue is the greater creative and musical achievement from Pink Floyd. A collection of 5 songs across 44 minutes, led by only one single, Have a Cigar, but supported by the essentially classic title track, Wish You Were Here. Thematically, the album runs significantly leaner than both Dark Side and The Wall, and it can be argued that the album is less driven by a cohesive theme than it is more a collective of Waters' own reflections of the past and what was surrounding the band at the time. It's just maybe coincidental that it lines up thematically, rather than as intentionally as The Dark Side of the Moon. We see this through the tributes to Syd Barrett on Shine On You Crazy Diamond, a song cut in half with parts 1 to 5 opening the album and parts 6 to 9 closing. This is the bulk of the record, taking up over half of the album's runtime. Additionally, Wish You Were Here longs for Barrett's return amid a band that is less cohesive as tensions continue to escalate with each passing release and tour. The remaining songs further criticize the music industry, a prelude to what would come on The Wall. And of course, I can't help but see the intersection of mental health and well-being of artists within the industry as a central idea. But again, this feels less like a thematic thesis that Watts is pushing and more of what was consuming his mind at the time of writing. Musically, this is their strongest album. Shine On You Crazy Diamond, parts 1 to 5, is a progressive odyssey that uses time and a slow burning pace to grow organically from a cinematic dreamscape into a bluesy, melancholic ballad that remains largely instrumental. There are elements to Gilmour's playing that feel nostalgic for Jimmy Page. In the rhythm parts, some of the leads, and the chord choices. But man, what a solo. Gilmour is a master of taste. His tones are some of the best, but his level of restraint, the way he can stretch out a bend, how he allows for a solo to develop, treating it like its own movement within a larger suite, is untouchable. It signifies such a phenomenal level of musicianship and songwriting that few others possess. It's incredibly refined. When the vocals kick in around the 9-minute mark, the song is a duel of dynamics. The song is melodically, harmonically, rhythmically, and structurally so simple, and yet Pink Floyd use all of their resources to make every note of this 13.5-minute journey gripping. The intention and conviction is tangible. The intention and conviction is equal to that of their dedication to the theme of Dark Side of the Moon, except now they've applied that dedication, that commitment, that conviction to a musical piece. Welcome to the Machine, by no means is a weak song, but of the 5, it is probably the lesser. The album Wish You Were Here, even at its worst, is still pretty great. It's not a song I skip, it just doesn't quite reach the others. However, the coldness of Wright's synths against the warmth of Gilmour's acoustic guitars remains spectacular. Featuring Roy Harper on vocals, Have a Cigar is a fantastic straight-ahead rocker dominated by Gilmour's riff and the counterpoint between him and Wright's almost oppressive synthesizer. It's funky, it's got a bit of a strut to it, and the outro solo sees Gilmour take on both the rhythm and lead parts seamlessly. Up until this point, this is perhaps the most direct and obvious critique from Pink Floyd of the music industry. The song itself is sung from the perspective of an industry executive, which is likely why they got Harper rather than Gilmour to sing the song. The opening line, "Come in here, dear boy, have a cigar, you're gonna go far. You're gonna make it. If you try, they're gonna love you." Right? If we keep going through the lyrics, the band is just fantastic. That's really what I think. Here comes the clincher. Oh, by the way, which one's Pink? It's so typical of some sort of executive to think Pink Floyd was led by someone actually named Pink, and I wouldn't be surprised if the band got such a laugh out of this lyric that they decided to make Pink the star of The Wall. But the song is like that first sort of, it's almost like a prequel to what is to come in The Wall, right? A theme that they're going to explore in a far more significantly deeper way on a later record. Wish You Were Here, the title track, is the crowning achievement. A heartfelt letter to Barrett through a simple but so incredibly weighty song. The dynamic between acoustic and electric is yet again a starring role, while Gilmour's voice cracks with a slight rasp, reminiscing on the absence from his friend. While simultaneously, Waters' lyrics allow for him to question his own integrity within his growing success. This is kind of one of those parallels that we saw on The Dark Side of the Moon with Brain Damage, right? That connection between Syd Barrett's well-being and Waters himself wondering if he can truly remain true to who he is, who he was, amid the band's incredibly rapidly increasing success. Wish You Were Here very well may be the greatest song from Pink Floyd, and perhaps one of the greatest songs to emerge from the 1970s. The song is perfect. There's nothing to this that I think could make it any better. There is no other direction to it. It's arguably the simplest of songs on the album. It's a straightforward ballad, and it just resonates in such a impactful and meaningful way. I think it is it's a rare example of such a perfect song. Parts 6 to 9 of Shine On You Crazy Diamond close the album, bookending the record in what can only be described as a 9-movement epic that continues to demonstrate the exceptional musicianship and songwriting within the band, but also a growing chemistry between Gilmour and Wright, whose interplay is seamless and ebbs and flows almost effortlessly without ever getting in the way of the other. The star of this album really is the ongoing conversation, the back and forth between Wright's array of synths and Gilmour's signature guitar. Wish You Were Here is without a moment of weakness. While less ambitious on a thematic level, the album excels musically. This is likely why both Gilmour and Wright have stated that it is their favorite album they made, with Wright stating, It's an album I can listen to for pleasure, and there aren't many Floyd albums that I can. Gilmour has also added, I, for one, would have to say that my favorite album, the Wish You Were Here album. The end result of all that, whatever it was, definitely has left me an album I can live with very, very happily. I like it very much. That's such an English way to talk about your favorite achievement, favorite musical achievement that you created. I like it very much. Additionally, reflecting on the writing and in the context of post-Dark Side, Gilmour stated, I had some criticisms of Dark Side of the Moon. One or two of the vehicles carrying the ideas were not as strong as the ideas that they carried. I thought we should try and work harder on marrying the idea and the vehicle that carried it so that they both had an equal magic. It's something I was personally pushing when we made Wish You Were Here. This in itself echoes the idea I have about most concept albums and my main criticism with The Wall, in that some of the musical aspects that are designed to carry the narrative elements are significantly weaker than the narrative elements themselves. And while this is less so apparent on The Dark Side of the Moon, there still is an element to it where the songs don't quite measure up to Wish You Were Here. I spent enough time gushing about The Dark Side of the Moon, and I have no complaints. The album is a masterpiece, but Wish You Were Here simply stands as a greater musical experience. The songs are all stronger. The band sounds focused on writing the highest caliber of music that they could, rather than being preoccupied with an overarching theme or narrative. Furthermore, it is among the most collaborative albums from the band, with Waters writing only Welcome to the Machine and Have a Cigar by himself. The rest of the tracks are also credited to Gilmour and Wright. Funny enough, Waters has stated, Dark Side of the Moon and The Wall were the most complete albums we ever made. Wish You Were Here came close without being a complete classic. For me, that album and Animals signaled the end of the band as it has before. Animals is another album that I considered when making this record. To me, it's such a early proto-prog record. It's so cool. The songwriting is inventive and experimental, and it's just such a fantastic album. But to me, it wasn't quite as compelling musically as Wish You Were Here. Animals would rest in between Wish You Were Here and The Wall, and echoing Waters' point, Animals is significantly less collaborative than Wish You Were Here, with all songs written by Waters with the exception of Dogs, which was written by Waters and Gilmour. The idea of the band splintering apart, if he was feeling that way on Wish You Were Here, by the time they reach Animals, it is largely just Waters that is doing the writing, and whether that's an intentional decision from the band or that's an intentional decision from Waters, which sounds more likely. By the time they reach The Wall, Waters is firmly steering the ship, having fired Wright and writing well over 90-something%, you can do the math, of the material. I think for my own preferences, this further connects to my wish that The Wall was far more collaborative, because looking at Wish You Were Here and looking at some of the best tracks on The Dark Side of the Moon, Pink Floyd is at their best when Waters is working actively with Gilmour and Wright for the sake of writing and composition. And that is where I think The Wall falls flat compared to Wish You Were Here. There is no denying the legendary status of Pink Floyd. Their influence on music of all facets is crucial for the development of popular music through the 1970s and onward. Their career has massive peaks, and the band has gone through a number of different eras, each worth reflecting. As stated, though, 1973 to 79 stands as their most vital period, bookended with a pair of albums, triumphs in every way. But I ask you, should Dark Side of the Moon and The Wall truly be the albums we immediately hone in on when looking at the legacy of Pink Floyd? Both albums are innovations of technology, songwriting, and musicianship, and the former of the two truly is a culminating point of these, alongside a greater artistic vision. But are they the best albums to put on and listen to, front to back? Better yet, could you put them into a playlist on shuffle and have each song work without the context of the rest of the album, without the context of the ambition, without the context of the setting that comes from the record? With all the songs speaking for themselves, Wish You Were Here does. And it is for these reasons that I believe that this is the quintessential Pink Floyd record, and ultimately is arguably the greatest representation of the band, not Waters, but the collective, at their peak. Thanks for checking out the first ever, and maybe the last ever, hot take episode. I had a lot of fun with this format. I don't think it will be the last ever. I enjoyed this one a lot. In 2 weeks, tune in for episode 19. I'm Jared Harris, and this is Beats by Jer.